Thank you very much, Rich. It's always a lot of fun to be able to talk to colleagues on your own campus, and I keep saying to people I've just returned to civilian life as a researcher after 8 years in the trenches of CIHR, so it's really terrific to be talking to the people who will more and more increasingly become colleagues with whom I relate and interact at UBC. What I thought I would do this evening, I know some of you in the room, but not all, just to help me get a sense of, amongst those of you here, how many of you are currently enrolled in a program as a student, a postdoc, or a PhD, graduate or undergraduate program at UBC? How many of you would be? Okay, so that's a good idea. Are any of you faculty? I can spy a couple of faculty, okay. And then other people from the community or who have an interest in working in the field? Okay, so a few others of categories I haven't identified yet, okay. Having come from the last 8 years at the world of CIHR, where, as you know, things are defined in terms of pillars 1, 2, 3, and 4, biomedical being 1, clinical 2, health services 3, and pillar 4 being population health researchers, thought it just might help me to have a bit of a sense of where you might situate yourself in terms of the orientation that you bring in terms of your interests in health. So any people here who would be declare themselves as pillar 1 biomedical researchers? Thought they might be few and far between. Okay. Pillar 2 clinical, do primarily clinical work. 3 health services research. Okay, some health services researchers. And pillar 4 population health. That would be the bulk. Okay, that's fine, just to give me a sense, because of course the world that I've been in as a social scientist for the last 8 years has been a world which is predominated by biomedical researchers, and indeed the Institute of Aging, which I led, between 56 and 53%, 56 and 63% of what we funded would actually be biomedical research, even for the Institute of Aging, led by a social scientist. So just interesting to get a bit of a distribution. What I thought I would do this evening is, my talk is really in 3 parts. What I'm going to do, first of all, is give you a broad overview of worldwide trends in aging and some of the implications, and really trying to take something of a global perspective there, but emphasizing throughout the heterogeneity of old age and some of the issues around diversity and variability. Then I want, and really the second part is to focus on 3 broad areas of research priority that have characterized Canadian research in aging over my 8 years leading the National Institute of Aging. And the health services area, of course, is where I myself do research as well. And then move at the end to a discussion of challenges and opportunities. Take a bit of time to look at some of the dominant narratives that frame our understanding and discussions of aging, both in terms of research and policy, and then quickly identify some new approaches that I think hold some promise in terms of how we will think of aging in the future. And as I go through, I've got, as I said to Rich, some slides where, for example, I allude to things which loomed very large in my life over the last 8 years, like the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging. So what I've done is bring some additional slides for those of you who may have a particular interest, and in the questioning later, we can, question and discussion, we can come back to those. So as you can see in this first slide, what I've tried to do here is just give you a representation, if you think of the pace of aging around the world. And what this is depicting for you are the number of years that it has taken or will take individual countries to move from 7 to 14% of their population over the age of 65. That's considered a very important transition at a population level, to move from 7 to 14%. So you can see that, France took 150 years to do what Canada took 65 years to do, and has just very recently hit that threshold of 14% over the age of 65. But you'll see over on the far right column for you that in some countries of the world, the pace of population aging is far more rapid. In some countries like China, and if you think of the implications on a population level given their size, this is a fantastic rate of growth and huge numbers of people. And if you look, you can see almost a developed world, developing world divide there. And in fact, some of the literature, China would not necessarily fit in this anymore now, but it's often said that countries of the developed world grew rich before they grew old. Countries in the developing world world, many of them are growing old before they grow rich. So just an interesting issue to keep in mind when we're looking at a population level of what aging means. This is one of the few slides I will show you where I actually take that whole population age 65 and over and actually consider them to be one. Because that to me is actually a problem. That what we do in so many of the statistics and so much of the rhetoric around aging is that we take an age span that can easily be 40, even 45, maybe even 50 years, and we homogenize. We put everybody into that, and we're referred to this as the elderly or the aged population, or use the term seniors, which I will only use once in this talk. And my argument is that increasingly that masks a tremendous amount of diversity and variability and leads to, certainly reinforces some of this notion about tsunamis and apocalypse, because we look at these large percentages of a population. But at no other point in the life cycle would we take an age range like 40 or 45 or 50 years and presume some kind of homogeneity amongst the population. So my argument is that really the language that we use, the research questions that we pose, the data that we analyze, the policies that we develop really must reflect this diversity and variability within and amongst populations of people over the age of 65. We easily have 2 generations over the age of 65. There's a lot of discussion about when does the next generation begin, but a lot of research looking at around ages 80 to 85, things change in people's life circumstances and often in their health in ways at a population level that we can distinguish between younger old and later old age. And again, for all of them, whatever you think that particular dividing point may be, issues of diversity and complexity. So just for a moment to focus on, for example, how the population of the world will look over the next period of time, what you can see here, and these are UN data, that if you looked at for all ages, we're looking at a 35% change in the world's population, but you start to look at 65 and above, 164% increase, 85 and over, a 301% increase in the population worldwide, and for centenarians, 100 and above, 745% change. I mean, these 745% of a small number is still a comparatively small number, but you get a sense of the order of magnitude of change. And it's this 85 and over, or in some cases considered to be 80, that I really want to focus on a little bit more in my remarks this evening. If we take that population 80 and over, let's translate the percentage change now into looking at millions. You will see that in the middle here, 2009, that's approximately where we are now with 101 million people. And over the next 40 years, we will actually move to 304 million people over aged 80. My argument is that we actually know very little about this population. And I recently did, as part of my farewell to CIHR analysis for my colleagues, I actually did an analysis of journals such as the Canadian Journal on Aging, even some of the US journals, to look at how little of the research that we do actually takes into account the oldest old population. The vast majority of studies will say, we looked at a population, mean age 72, standard deviation 6 years, that kind of thing, 73, 78. Very rarely actually even acknowledging that there might be a distinction between the younger old and older old populations. What's interesting in terms of the data on the 80 years and over, by the way, is in Canada, where I was recently looking at data on 85 and over, 70% of the people aged 85 and over in Canada are women. So you've also got a whole interplay of age and gender here that's being somewhat masked in these data. This is the global distribution on the proportion of where the people aged 80 and over are. Canada is buried down here in this all others, way down at the bottom. Can I get this to line up here? This is a very awkward pointer. But in the all others, it includes Oceania and North America, except the United States. So we're down here, we're not contributing much overall to where the distribution of people 80 and over will be. China, of course, will be enormous. And that's one of the major issues in China with the aging of their population and the implications of one-child policy. But this is just to give you a little bit of distribution. Let's pull away from that notion of 65 and actually focus on another population. That having been said, some of the data show us that if you even take 60 or 65, that 22% of the world's population will be 60 and over by 2050, and over the next 30 years in Canada, the number of people will double. So these are just ways that we have to be thinking about increases. I'm not spending any time today talking about 100 years and over. These are three birthday cards that I purchased in a little shop in rural Ireland a couple of years ago, and I thought, you know, when the card manufacturers are onto this, this is really telling us something, and I was particularly impressed by this one because, of course, this is for a man reaching 100 years and over, and that's a pretty rare thing. I actually have a whole repertoire. I collect these things, but anyway. But I thought it was very important to signal that while we're not doing that much research on 80 and above, there's actually a very substantial body of research going on centenarians. A researcher at the Einstein Medical Center in New York is doing research among a particular group, an elderly Jewish population who are particularly long-lived, and looking at, you know, what are the characteristics of a man 104 years old who comes into his office a couple of times a week, and his sister comes, and his 85-year-old son, and his 62-year-old grandson. What is it that those people have that the rest of us don't? And they've discovered, amongst other things, that they have unusually high levels of good cholesterol, for example. So you can just imagine that the pharmaceutical companies are very interested in learning how could they develop a synthetic version of whatever it is keeps those people living well and for so long. So interestingly enough, very, very fascinating research on centenarians, and not that much for the age group immediately below it. When I talk about this notion of 2 generations over the age of 65, the photos that I'm about to show you sometimes work and sometimes don't. I can tell you they've worked very well with deputy ministers of health in a lot of the provinces in Canada. Because what I'm going to show you is, it would be ideal if this was a woman, but in fact it's not, because we know older women outnumber older men. But this is often what we think about when we think of a population of older people. The elderly man into his 80s, he was almost 90 at the point that this photograph was taken, now deceased. But what we have to be thinking about, his son. Now some of you, my generation, will absolutely recognize Sir Mick Jagger, who turned 68 years old last July. And I send him a card every year. He hasn't responded yet, but since he turned 65, I have sent something to his music publishing company. But this is Sir Mick and his dad, Joe. But I think what this helps us to realize, it's a face of the 2 generations over the age of 65. That's the point that I'm trying to make. That you can imagine that they represent very different health beliefs, health behaviors, expectations. And yet constantly we're focusing on one, the dad's generation, or we're lumping the 2 of them together in one way and saying it's a tsunami and we have to prepare for it. When in fact, the Sir Micks of the world, I think we have to increasingly thinking about as a resource that can actually help us to deal with the challenges as the population gets old. So that's one way of thinking about the 2 generations over 65. Another way is also realizing what happens to us ourselves as we get older. There's a lot of language about, you know, 70 is the new 50 or whatever, and how we can actually deny aging, delay aging. And this is a photograph that I used to use in my courses in social gerontology to show the vigor and the vitality of someone at the age of 67. It was a little bit of an eye-opener to look at this man 12 years later. Now, the photographer has played a bit with image, and I couldn't adjust for that because one photograph is closer and one slightly further away, which will make him look smaller. But what this is showing us is that in spite of being obviously an incredibly physically fit individual, time does bring age-related physical changes. And we have to look at the not just how he is functioning physically, but we might imagine that along with his now entry into age 80 and over, that there would be other kinds of life changes that are associated with that. So in terms of this notion of 2 generations over 65, I just think it's important for us to think, when my baby sister turned 50 in 1960, she, like 60% of the people in her cohort, had a parent who was still alive. In Canada today, and I was actually talking with someone at StatsCan earlier today, and I couldn't get a more current figure because I think this is a little dated now. The data that we have show that 10% of people over 65 also have a child who's over 65. So I give an example here of a dear friend of mine who's 72, her mother just turned 100, another relative who's 67, and his mother is age 93. Very typical. We increasingly know about these situations in Canada, and yet in our language and in our policy and practice and discussion, we rarely make those kinds of distinctions, and I believe that we need to. I was very heartened to see that Europe just recently produced, after 2 years of consultation, a roadmap for aging research across the European Union, and a tremendous amount of focus in there on the notion of 2 generations and the need to know more about the oldest old. So quickly, as I round out that section on demographics, I think I've made the point already, very few studies worldwide on aged 80 and over. And in fact, when Rich was mentioning the honorary degree from Newcastle, one of the things that Newcastle in the UK is very well known for is one of the best studies of the age 80 and over population in the world. The thoroughness, the rigor of that, the way that they've been engaged in that research over a period of time. And what they and other researchers have shown is the tremendous range of variability and capability amongst that population. Because it's a survivor population in many ways. It's lived longer than the average life expectancy for men and for women. So increasingly we do need to talk about young old age, older old age, and even deep old age of 100 and above, and be aware of the heterogeneity that's implied there. And I think consistent with that, and I'll come back to this point briefly at the end, is our interpretation of resource or apocalypse. And I just give 3 examples in here of the Auditor General's report, or the International Monetary Fund's interpretation of that aging of the population as apocalypse, contrasted with a very fine, well-researched article by André Picard of the Globe and Mail about just over a year ago, where he's showing it's not a silver tsunami that's the cause of the apocalypse. It's the tsunami of more. And gives excellent data around, the percentage of how many more MRI machines, how many more bone density tests we're doing today than we did 10 years ago. We're all getting more medical treatment, and that's part of the cause of the things that we attribute to the aging of the population. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I felt it was important to at least acknowledge how, when we look to the future in Canada, immigration is certainly making a difference for us in Canada in terms of, as some would say, protecting us from what aging might mean at a population level. But in fact, it is an issue in Canada that we know very little about. Many people who come to Canada and age in a foreign land, grow old in a country they weren't born in. What does that actually mean? What does it look like? What are the health beliefs and health behaviors that guide their access to services? In many cases, even in the studies that we do, we don't have well thought through recruitment and retention strategies for ethnocultural minorities or members of ethnocultural groups in much of the research that we do. So I think this is a real gap in Canadian research, and we can come back to that. I just threw this in just for a bit of fun. I was sitting in a theater in Vancouver recently, and it was one of the few examples. I loved it because it just leaped right off the pages, and it's an ad for a home care company. But you look at this first and you think, well, these are the 2 elderly people, who can now travel again, but they can travel because mom is getting help from this home care agency. And I thought this is one of the few examples sort of out in the world out there where I actually was seeing reference to retired people being the younger of a generation that also included their mother. So I threw that in. So let me turn now for a few minutes to focus on 3 broad research areas which were dominant during my period of time as scientific director of the Institute of Aging. And I'll just introduce them by saying, first of all, I want to talk about the disease that individuals and societies fear most. Anybody have a sense of what disease that might be? Dementia. So we're going to talk about dementia. Then I'd like to speak a little bit about what the WHO says is the best guarantee of retaining independence and being able to cope in old age. Anyone have an idea of what that might be? Well, that would be important. That would be important. Mobility. They say mobility is actually key, so that's relating to that. And then we'll talk a bit about what cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and dementia have in common. Aging. They all increase with age. So those are the three things that we're going to go through. So this is probably a graph that you've seen in many cases over the years, the projected increase over time in the rise in dementia through to 2036 for both men and for women. And this statistic, along with many other attention-grabbing statistics, appear in a document that our institute helped develop with the Alzheimer's Society of Canada in 2010 called The Rising Tide, and many more graphs that actually look at the expected increase in dementia. What's often masked in some of the data like that is this notion of how it will differ by age in Canada. And certainly we see tremendous variation. Dementia is largely a disease of later old age, although that's often not identified. Nevertheless, the figures are quite compelling when you look at what's expected over the next 20, 30 years in terms of the increase in the numbers of people with dementia. But you can see it's 1 in 40 people aged 65 to 74 and 1 in 3 aged 85 and over. What's interesting here is that some of these figures actually include mild cognitive impairment. So it's always important in the data on dementia to look at, are we talking about Alzheimer's disease? Are we talking about other kinds of dementias, vascular dementia, Lewy body, or mild cognitive impairment? Where on that continuum is the ailment that's been identified? And there's some argument that, in fact, if we all live to be 115, every one of us will have some form of mild cognitive impairment, indeed. But this is certainly an attention-grabbing statistic. What's been interesting here in the work that we did with the Institute of Aging, of all the international collaborations we had, the one with China around Alzheimer's disease was the one where we were able to get the attention of the health researchers and authorities there, because they project they will have 35 million people with dementia within 20 years, the entire population of Canada. So you can imagine if you want to get brain imaging or work on the biomedical aspects of Alzheimer's disease and dementia, that's where you go. And there is a tremendous international worldwide effort to actually focus on dementia. And what I think is interesting there is much of that research is focused on cure. Finding the silver bullet, what are the causes, the biomedical causes, very little focus on care. That's where France, I think, has been doing a tremendous amount of work, actually focusing on care. I won't spend a lot of time here, and this is actually a bit dated slide, but it stood the test of time. But this is just basically the work of Bruckenmeier attempted to show if we could delay the onset by 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 years, we would actually reduce the number of people who actually are living with Alzheimer's disease by a substantial amount over a period of time. So that's the argument behind much of the research that does an attempt to delay the onset of Alzheimer's. And knowing there wouldn't be many biomedical people in the room, and this is a dangerous slide for a social scientist to show, but I just wanted to show you that the thinking right now is that a lot of these abnormal enzymes and biochemical responses are actually showing up in the pre-symptomatic phase. So the thinking here amongst many of the biomedical scientists is, if we could actually, have a pinprick, do something equivalent to the way we can test our glucose levels or blood sugar levels for diabetes, we can do that kind of testing at home. If there was a way to determine who was actually showing elevations in some of these measurements of tau, et cetera, early on, then we would be able to try to delay the onset through early diagnosis. So that's what's behind that discussion. And then, as I said, there's a very elaborate, complex research strategy. CIHR is leading and very engaged internationally around Alzheimer's disease and dementias. I won't focus on that. Let me turn now, so that's one area, and if that is of interest to you, we can have a bit more discussion. In terms of the mobility area, this is an area where, again, you'll see some tremendous differential in the data in terms of impairment by different age groups within later life. We know that this is an area which is often under the radar in terms of the cost to the healthcare system. If you look at the number of hip fractures, the high numbers of people with hip fracture who die in 1 year, this is a quite extraordinary statistic, and that in fact less than 40% of people ever regain their pre-fracture mobility levels. Are there people in the room who've actually had a family member or someone they know who's experienced fracture? So Linda has, several of you have there. So you know the impact of these kinds of, how devastating they can be in terms of quality of life. So in Canada over the last 8 years, this was an area that was identified to us as very important. And we put a lot of resources into funding research teams. And I would say this is an area where we've seen unusual strength in Canada. Even here in Vancouver, across SFU and UBC in areas of assistive devices and technologies, tremendous research. What was of interest to us was how little was being done on age-supportive built environments, an area where Europe is far ahead of us. And I just brought this slide courtesy of some UBC colleagues, just to show the thinking of, this is how we currently build many of our urban areas now, with shopping centers and apartments and schools down here and very broad distances, big yards, into separate housing. This is less characteristic of Vancouver, of course, than many places. But if you look at a much more dense kind of urban environment, which would be promoting of walkability, and that notion of walkability has become increasingly recognized as important and as a way to deal with the aging of the population and to promote exercise and activity for people as they age. So this is the kind of model that's being discussed now in areas of Vancouver, along certain corridors within the urban environment and across the country. And the website, the web link is here for a particular project based at UBC, funded by the Institute of Aging, called Walk the Talk, and focusing on transforming the built environment and really looking at that notion of walkability, pedestrian friendliness, as we call it, and accessibility for individuals as they get older. And a real recognition that there is this whole field of environmental gerontology alive and well in many parts of Europe, from which we can learn a tremendous amount, and that a lot of the age-related decrements in terms of mobility are a function not necessarily of just the changes that individuals experience, but the environments that we create for people as they get older. So that's all I'm going to say about mobility at this point in time. The third area that I wanted to touch on relates to health services. And that was another large area of funding for our institute, and we did conduct in the early years a number of research workshops across the country with groups of older people and their advocates and policymakers, for them to inform the Institute of Aging as to what they thought were the key issues that they were dealing with in relation to health. And you can see that healthcare and health services were the number one area, with the housing care continuum really referring to that aging in place or aging at home, and health promotion. So in terms of healthcare and health services, I put up this slide because, as you'll see in a minute, and even when I talk about mobility, less so when I talk about mobility, but certainly when I talk about cognitive impairment, one of the ways that, dare I say it, something like a Canadian Institutes of Health Research is set up is very much disease by disease and function by function. I always like to say the Institute of Aging was one of those institutes at CIHR that put the whole human being back together. And one reason that it's particularly important to put the whole human being back together as you get older is if you start to look here, and you're looking at the number of chronic diseases that people have. And as you continue to go through, let's say if this is arthritis versus dementia, for example, or diabetes. What happens, of course, as people get older is the increase in comorbidities or multiple morbidities. And the more we frame the research enterprise disease by disease, we're failing to get at this, or the way we treat people, or the way that we offer health services. I guess you've all had the experiences I had recently. I guess I didn't look around my physician's office too often, but I was in there recently and I was kind of shocked to see it actually said one problem at a time. Have people seen that in their physician's office? I mean, this is absolutely unrealistic in many cases. I'm going to talk about my sinuses tomorrow, and I'll talk about my ankles next week, or whatever you do. I mean, it simply doesn't, but it's the way we deliver and fund health services in this country. So with the aging of the population and the kind of data that you just saw in that slide, you can see why that will become increasingly problematic. So I've got data in here showing that the system is designed for single conditions, that it doesn't focus on complex mix of conditions, and that our challenge is to try to target a whole constellation of health issues with a combination of interventions. So, and then there's some data there on the number of comorbidities. 68% of people, elderly people, have 2 or more chronic conditions. So a lot of the discussion in Canada now around primary health care, which could be a topic for an evening in and of itself, is related to this issue of how do we address the whole person, and some of the issues around scopes of practice for health professionals. And I know that's one area that the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences is looking with various healthcare professions now on how do we get more flexibility in scopes of practice so that nurses can do some of the things that physicians used to do, for example. But these are challenges that the aging of the population is forcing us to consider because we can't continue to do business as usual. And some of us would argue that's a very good thing, actually, that we are forced to start to think in a different way about how we deliver services. So when we talk about shaping some of the issues of the future, there are those issues around cognitive impairment, mobility, and health services. Those are clearly big drivers of the research agenda and certainly how we frame the way we offer, the way we address issues of aging. But as well, I want to talk for a few moments about, because we're sitting in the academy, many of us are researchers, some of the implications in terms of research and the way we approach issues of aging. One of the areas that was a bit of unfinished business for me that was a bit frustrating when I left after 8 years is that we'd finally begun to really focus on harmonizing and integrating the data that we already have. Because many of us know that we put a lot of resources into funding large initiatives, and when you're studying aging, it's almost invariably a very complex process, and yet we have very little linkage within and across projects. So how can we link the UK Biobank study, for example, to the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, to the health and retirement surveys, family of surveys that are going on around the world, and get better harmonization and linkage across those areas of data? We're being forced, I think, in many ways by the challenges now of return on investment, the discussion about that in terms of research, to have these dialogues, and I think that that's really important. Increasingly, we need complex research designs that enable us to look at transitions and trajectories and life course approaches, and I'll just show in a minute how the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging intends to do that. The factors that impact the experience of aging and old age very rarely actually included in the research that we're doing, and then just I'll come to a discussion of some of the new scientific approaches. So I've mentioned several times the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, which was funded during my time as scientific director. This was probably the thing that I was obsessed about, and I think in a positive way. But this is a study which is tracking 50,000 Canadians over 20 years, Canadians aged 45 years and older. We have all the funding in place for the first 5 years, a total of $56 million for the first 5 years of the CLSA. It's based at McMaster University, but there is a node here in Vancouver that will be based at the Brain Research Centre, but with links to Simon Fraser University as well. So people are being recruited into that study as we speak. Of the 50,000, 20,000 have been recruited through Stats Canada, through the Canadian Community Health Survey, and the other 30,000 will have to live close to an urban centre to come in for clinical assessment on a regular basis. So we had to get those sites up and running across the country. And the vision and aim for the CLSA was really to develop a research platform, which for those of you who are in the early stages of your careers, really is designed to exist as a platform that can be accessed by you in terms of the research that you're doing, and to really study aging as a dynamic process really from midlife through. And in the various international reviews that were done of the CLSA, what was deemed to be unique to Canada about a study like this, it was the fact that it was starting at age 45 was one thing. Most studies of aging do not start that young. That secondly, we have the capacity to link to health administrative data in many of the provinces in Canada, well, in all of the provinces, but in some better than others. And thirdly, we have one of the most ethnoculturally diverse countries on earth. And so learning about aging in this context will tell us things we don't know, say, from other studies like the English Longitudinal Study on Aging. So I have some other slides, and I'd be delighted at any time to talk with you, but if you just Google even CLSA, you'll learn a lot about the Canadian Longitudinal Study. So for the final section of what I want to talk about, I want to spend a little bit of time on this notion of narratives and what we attribute to aging, either correctly or incorrectly, because that's so much of the rhetoric that's out there now. The sky is falling, the world is coming to an end. We're not celebrating that we have lived, we've achieved longevity. We've achieved a kind of longevity that no society before us has, and yet if you open your paper, it's usually this is the worst catastrophe that it could have possibly befallen us. So I think that that's one of the things I want to focus on, and I think as part of that, we do continually have to look at how aging intersects with a whole range of other factors to produce diversity and variability and inequality in ways that get glossed over in some of the homogenizing that we do. And then some of the policies that we have. I've said that immigration may actually protect Canada from some of the impacts of the aging of the population and low birth rates. And at a policy level, we can actually impact what happens. And I want to end with a bit of a need for, emphasize the need for a long view, not a quick fix, which in political and policy terms is very difficult to do. So I'm going to focus on these first two. Does aging increase healthcare costs, and what do dependency ratios imply? So this is just a smattering. I mean, you talk about the rhetoric and the language. For 1 week in October, I was doing a little bit of traveling because I am on leave. So it was fascinating just to sort of see what was randomly coming my way. So this is a bit of a showstopper when you open up the paper in Auckland, New Zealand, and this is what you see staring out at you. And this was, trust me, a large sheet showing the man and the three women in bed, and it was showing what the looming crisis will be in terms of aged care in New Zealand, that there's simply overcrowding, not enough room for everybody. Canada, the focus, was this Canada? Yes, the focus on Freedom 55, it's going to go to 67. This was in Australia, nurses give aged care ultimatum, and this was also in Australia, the arthritis epidemic. And this is Canada, and how can you avoid it? A cover of a magazine that popped through the mailbox one. That's a pretty typical day in the life of someone in aging, when you're on the lookout for what's out there. What's the popular discourse around issues of aging? Alarmist, concerning, etc. So one of the big things that we continually hear is that aging is pushing up the cost of healthcare in the country. This is a pretty standard kind of graph that you will see, and you'll see that for any period except the first year of life, when we're all pretty expensive, after about age 40, 44, the increases, the costs just go up astronomically. And that is true. I mean, we can't deny that. But what is interesting is if you start to actually break that down, and I thank my colleague, formerly at StatsCan, Michael Wolfson, now at the University of Ottawa, for showing this to me. And here we have a comparison of the costs between 1998 and 2008. And what you will see, and we focus particularly on the first year of life and within these age groups, is that within age groups, we have fairly significant, in some cases, increases in costs. If you were 80 years old in 1998, this is what you cost the system. 2008, you can see how it's risen. So aging is not accounting for that rise. It's other things, and it is the fact that we're all on many more medications than we used to be 10 years ago. We're all getting more tests and diagnostics. The way that, when there's colleagues on this campus who can speak to this far more clearly than can I, but this is just one illustration of something. Yes, they're rising, but there's a lot of the rise that's attributable to other things. This is another graph courtesy of Michael, and we won't spend a lot of time here, but this is the standard. A lot of the apocalyptic approach is defined in terms of ratios, the dependency ratios within the population, and particularly in terms of the proportion of people in old age relative to those who are in the age group. It's defined purely in demographics in terms of numbers, the working age population. So these are alarmist. If you look over on this side, which is the annual paid hours of work per person in Canada, and you've taken age out of this, what you're seeing is from 1971 through to 2031 projected, a real increase, and this is about where we are now, in the annual paid hours of work per person, a real increase. And that's expected, as the population ages, to drop off between now and 2031, but only to about the level that it was back in about 1991. That's where it will go. So in fact, people are working more. They're actually contributing economically. You're not necessarily there focused on just saying, well, if you're of a certain age, then you obviously qualify in terms of on the dependency side of the continuum. So you just look at here the different messages that you get, how the narrative changes depending on which statistic you look at. And that's the point that I want to make there. The call for the long view, I think, has never been made more eloquently than by our colleague from British Columbia, Marcus Hollander. And this is a very interesting slide. And I actually showed this to some colleagues in Europe recently, and I thought it was interesting. Of all the things in my presentation, this was the one they wanted to take time on the phone afterward and go through. What this is showing you in the work of Marcus Hollander, and I put the web link down here for those who are interested. In Victoria, the per person average overall costs of healthcare for continuing care patients in areas where there were cuts and where there were not cuts in preventive home care in the province of British Columbia. And what this is showing, that in the year prior to the cuts in British Columbia, these were the average per person overall costs. So the areas where the cuts took place, they went in and cut in areas where people were costing the system more. And in only 3 years, which we know in the life of a researcher is virtually nothing, look at what the areas where the cuts, how we had an increase in the per person average overall cost of healthcare versus the areas where there were not the cuts. So what data like this showed, I wrote to Marcus recently, I didn't hear back from him to find out, okay, this was 2001, presumably you've got more data now. Where did it go in the long term? Did these people who were taken off preventive home care continue to cost the system much, much more, quite a bit more, and how did that actually play out over time? The problem, of course, with policy is that we don't take these things into consideration. You demonstrate the cuts. It may not even be the same government or the same people in the health authority 3 years later, but these are the types of things that we have to keep in mind. And in many cases, it's not that the old people are costing us more, is that we make changes to a system and they do end up costing us more, because preventive home care, which someone once said to me, is a hospitality service. I actually had that said to my face. It's a hospitality service to go in and help with shopping and transportation. Well, it's a hospitality, it's not a health service. So if you say it's not a health service, but it's going to impact costing the health system more in the long run. So this division in the way many provinces now divide health and social services has real implications when it's added into the mix of the aging of the population. There are some things that I think we have to worry about. And this is a colleague by actually a former student of mine, Janice Keefe. This is an article that some analysis that she did, which was looking at the gender implications of family structure in Canada and the reduced availability of surviving children over time. And this is for women, but as I said, most of the very elderly people are women. So what we will start to see over time, and around 2030, 2021 is when it will begin, is a real increase in the number of people who have no surviving children. As the baby boomers who didn't have as many children as their parents, as the baby boomers begin to enter deep old age. And that's, I mean, we're not as a society totally dependent on how our adult children care for us. It's actually partners who provide most of the care to us in later life. But this is still, if you think of a system where we're cutting access to home care, we're making real changes, we're assuming that there are family members there and available to provide services, we have to be mindful of these kinds of data over time. What implications? Maybe they'll have very little implications, but we have to prepare for that contextual reality. I also think in the course of my 8 years in my position, I saw a tremendous difference in the way that we as researchers engaged with older people themselves. And we moved, in the words of one of the people on the Institute of Aging Advisory Board, from advocacy to partnership increasingly. And I think many of us now, with the new SHRC regulations, for example, social sciences and humanities, around partners in the research enterprise that we do. And increasingly we know it is important to engage the older people who are participating in our study in actually helping to frame the questions and contributing in a way. And this is a book that was actually funded through the result of some funds that the Institute of Aging put into this small group about back in 2003, an open access book published by the University of Calgary, I guess nearly 2 years ago now, but focusing on issues of engaging older people in research. But I think it nicely represents this move to advocacy. So the issue of the change in survival rates of children, the engagement of older people themselves in research, these are contextual factors that will, I think, really shape how we do research in aging in the future. And I took out a slide I had there, but I'll just briefly mention, and I think it will come up here somewhere in a minute anyway. Yes, around issues of obesity and how that's anticipated that may actually start to reduce life expectancy, that we may be among the first generation historically who do not live as long as our parents did due to issues of obesity, particularly in countries like the United States and parts of Europe, but countries like Canada are not immune to it as well. So some very interesting work with the MacArthur Foundation in the United States focusing on that, but I'll just mention it. So I think I hope I've tried to give you a sense that we've got, to some extent, these competing narratives around issues of aging. So on the one hand, we hear a lot about large swaths of the population having no or limited pension plans, and there was an article in the Globe and Mail this week some of you may have seen. On the other hand, we know that there's a tremendous amount of wealth inequity in the population that's now reaching later life. And what was the statistic that I pulled up the other day that I found? That baby boomers control over 55% of all discretionary spending in Canada. So you've got these competing understandings of not much pension, in some cases are changing access to pension, which I'm not minimizing, but I'm saying we have to be looking at both sides in terms of the equity issue. You'll hear, people will say to me, is 70 the new 50? You know, we've never been healthier as a population of older people as we are today. And that is important to recognize. But you also hear as well, focus, I mean, the Globe and Mail has had enormous special editions on the rising tide of dementia. And I'm not diminishing the importance of that, but we're not seeing that other side of the health and activity, that this population of people now entering later life are healthier than people in that age group have ever been before. We've got this issue on the one hand of the rise in obesity-related illness, the expectation that it will either reduce life expectancy, or Jay Olshansky and people at the MacArthur Foundation will say, we'll have a bifurcation in life expectancy. And you'll have people who enter old age who are well, who are physically active, who are monitored and healthy, and their life expectancy will continue to increase, as has been the case historically. You'll have another population of people within that population who are morbidly obese, who have a whole range of obesity-related health issues. And for example, we have no idea, what does it mean to have diabetes for 30, 40 years? Childhood obesity rates in the United States now, very alarmingly high. What does that actually mean at a population level if you start to see that? So could that population be the first in human history that do not live as long as their parents? So we see that language at the same time that we see a lot of discussion about the promise of technology in terms of increasing our lives, or our quality of life for sure. The promise of personalized medicine. Heard a tremendous amount about that at CIHR. Biogerontology, the role of inflammation, getting incredible traction now in some of the areas within biological aspects of aging. Epigenetics, understanding of epigenetics and how that may actually impact in the future how we age. So you begin to see these tensions in terms of how we focus. On the other hand, in many ways, I've been surprised in Canada how little discussion there has been around the implications for aging of ethnocultural diversity, and I've already alluded to this. In this country, we have close to 1/3 of people over the age of 65 who were not born in Canada. Now, many of them came from Western Europe as young children, right after the war or before the war, and they have aged in place in this country. But we also know that a large number of them, through Canada's policies of family reunification, came later in life to Canada and are aging in a very foreign land for them. And the issues of accessibility of service, appropriateness of services, and their health beliefs and practices, not well understood. I think there's some very interesting work going on in Vancouver. Of course, we have 42% of our population visible minorities. But you might expect that here, but still not much done, I think, when I look at what CIHR has funded. So just to conclude, the final area where I take some hope from what I've seen recently is increasing discussion about a new way of looking at issues of aging, a new focus for research on aging that tries to move away from focusing only on the diseases of old age, getting away from research that is dominated by Alzheimer's disease. And when I say dominated, even for an institute led by a social scientist with a mandate cover all 4 of CIHR's pillars, Alzheimer's research alone constituted 30% of what we funded as an Institute of Aging, a huge proportion for one disease. And there's an increasingly recognized need to, and I'm quoting here from Abbott's article in Nature from 2004, looking at a whole host of genetic and environmental factors, lifestyle, that allow people to remain healthy into their 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. What can we learn from that sort of, that horizontal thinking across diseases in terms of what are the basic biological, social, cultural factors related to aging that play into that physiological. And I thought it was interesting that the Royal Society in the UK, the last quote there, just last year had a task force that was focusing on broad spectrum preventative medicine for age-related disease. That's quite an accomplishment for an august body like the Royal Society in the UK to actually say we need to move away from this disease focus and much more broadly. So there has been, led by the National Institutes of Health in the United States, the suggestion of the emergence of a field of Jarrow science. The promise is that Jarrow science or Jarrow sciences will do for the understanding of aging what the creation of neurosciences 40 years ago did for our understanding of the brain, by bringing people in a whole host of disciplines together. And the one real example of that is the Buck Institute in California, funded by NIH in 2007, where they've thrown out the notion of departments. They've brought people from a whole range of areas. Now, admittedly, most of them are looking at biomedical issues, but they are coming together to try to understand the basic biological underpinning of aging, and really understanding this is a complex process that's not really amenable to the traditional ways that we have done research. But linked to that also is understanding more about very old people, people who live well into old age, and what we might learn from that. So to try to keep to Rich's, if I can get in under 45, 50 minutes, his directive, and I quite agree with that. So what I'd like to think you've heard today is something about the implications of 2 generations over the age of 65, how when we hear that lumped figure of 65 and over, we need to question that and actually think about, even as a society, as we plan for the aging of the baby boom generation. Well, the first of the baby boomers to hit 65 turned 65 in 2011. If you look at, whereas I hope I've demonstrated for you, many of the significant age-related issues start to emerge for many people in their late 70s and early 80s, we have a planning horizon here. We have to think about how we're going to take advantage of that planning horizon, but we do have it. So that notion of the diversity and complexity and variability, and not thinking about this as a homogeneous population, I hope you've heard that. I hope you have some sense of aging as more than the sum of the chronic diseases. Or as I used to say to the current president of CIHR, who was an Alzheimer's researcher after all, aging is not a neurodegenerative disease. And we have to understand that. It is not a neurodegenerative disease. So what are even though some of the key health issues involve cognitive impairment, mobility issues are prevalent for large proportions of the population, and the way we deliver health services are equally important. I've talked a little bit about the healthcare system and some of the need for reform. I hope you've got a sense very quickly, these are all just really touching very quickly, but how some of the narratives play out. I think that could be a talk in and of itself, and some of the policy debates that arise in relation to that, and some of the opportunities for emerging science in terms of thinking about aging and not just disease. I think it will become increasingly important that we engage public and stakeholders in the discussions that we have. And I just touched on this very briefly, but this is something I feel very strongly about, the need increasingly for research collaborations, utilization of data that we already have, that we're spending a lot to collect, and harmonization of the data that we have. These are I'll end with 2 photos that I took, one very recently in New Zealand. And so future is aging, but aging is changing, because the first photo taken in Europe maybe about 2001, 2002, showing this elderly couple. I think the frailty, what probably leaps off that sign, is the frailty of the couple. Although several people said to me, what do you think she's doing in his pocket with a hand in his pocket? I have heard that, but anyway. But the second side is a photo that I took in New Zealand, just in mid-October when I was there. And while it is still, I don't know if this is a warning or a celebration or what it's meant to be, you're just coming into this little town in New Zealand, but I liked the vigor and robustness of the aged character who's crossing the road compared to some of the earlier depictions. So I will leave you with that, and maybe before we absolutely close off, I'm going to have a final skill testing question, and maybe we can come back. And no one's allowed to Google or go on and find out what Tom Kirkwood actually said in that article. But I'll leave you to ponder that as we have hopefully a few minutes for discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I'm going to leave it to you to handle questions.
I want to start with a knowledge translation question. I've seen the data on the data that counteracts the argument about the silver tsunami.
Yeah.
Why doesn't that die? Why do we still hear the same arguments that are obviously not true? In whose interest is this continuing perpetually?
I mean, there's certainly, well, what did you just mumble, Rick? The Vancouver Sun. I mean, certainly someone was talking recently about how many issues in our society, just with the relentlessness of a press 24/7, and there's always has to be a story in some way. And many of these issues, they are at an individual level, they're real and they're tragic and they're compelling. When you see that whole 10-part series that the Globe and Mail did on Alzheimer's disease and dementia, we know that the long-term care system in Canada now has changed phenomenally over the last 15, 20 years. Most of the people who are living in those facilities do suffer from some form of severe cognitive impairment. Not all, but the vast majority. And so we have to think about how we're going to deal with that. But I'm blocking on the name of the BC researcher who talks about this notion of a meme, where you get this notion that's projected in the media, and he wrote that very interesting book about sickness. Anyway, not Arthur Sweetman, but anyway, it's a name like that. But some of that just, really is quite compelling for people when you read about it. There are some very reasoned accounts, I think, of alternative points of view. But you're right, we're not necessarily good at getting that message out. I've certainly tried talking as much as I can, but that's one person. But there is a balance. It's not to deny that for some portions of the population, these are issues and concerns. But this notion that the world is coming to an end with the aging of the population, I think is more recognized now to be, do you think?
Reports from NGOs, from governments, having to do with how we organize the health system, how we pay for it, and they still start with that bald statement of this.
Yeah.
The silver tsunami is going to kill us.
Yeah. Well, as I did cite, for example, the article from the International Monetary Fund, Sheila Fraser's report as an Auditor General. That you would think that that's a pretty credible source. It starts on a premise, how the aging of the population is going to bankrupt the system as we know it. So these are real challenges. Now, when you talk to people in provinces who say, well, all I can tell you is that my budget is going up by 15% every 2 years or whatever, so something is driving that. But it's interesting how ready people seem to be to accept that aging alone is accounting for so many of those changes. And older people as bed blockers. When the question is, yes, we all know an older person who's been a bed blocker. I had someone just call me yesterday how she can't get her mother out of an acute care facility because she doesn't have the access to the resources that she needs to go home. Well, we know that we need 32,000 more home support, or whatever you call them, home support worker, personal care worker, whatever. We know that we need that in this country. And that you're never going to stop the blockade up here if you don't have people who are trained and out in the community. But you can't make the kind of cuts, frankly, that British Columbia made and have that demographic change and not see that you've got a problem with bed blocking.
Social class, you talk about gender and other things. Can you say something about the role of social class with regard to differentiating the market?
I mean, it's a very interesting issue, Don, because I did talk about some of the issue around consolidation of wealth and in the baby boomer population, et cetera, and so we know that there's that population. I mean, it's interesting, I've actually heard people say we all have that notion, you know, that money doesn't buy happiness, but it certainly makes your life easier in later life. And one of the real challenges right now is in the absence of, in many provinces where we have, and I think it's not inappropriate to have closed some of the long-term care facilities to get away from that notion of an old age home. People who were in, my husband's grandmother was in an old age home from about age 78 to 98. She lived 20 years there. Well, that kind of, someone in her kind of state of health would never be in one of those facilities today. So we have, those are now for people where there's more medical need, and we've tried to develop alternatives. So some things are good. But one of the challenges, and even in a province like this, is we've got a lot of private development now, building these assisted living facilities with very little thought to people being able to live, that they may live longer than their money does in many cases. There are game analyzable dilemmas here for many people in terms of how they make decisions about where they're going to go in later life. So when I talk about the fact that, for example, for people who live in ethnocultural enclaves, we often have this notion, particularly in terms of aging, you know, it's wonderful. People are living in generational houses and they're with people who speak the language that they do and support them culturally. What we often find when we penetrate a little more deeply is that they're there out of absolute economic necessity. They simply don't have an alternative in many cases. So we don't have a good sense of that. I mean, there's certainly, we know as a country we have improved the lot of people who get older. One of my main research areas is widowhood. And there is no doubt that women today who are widowed, particularly in their 50s or early 60s, many fewer of them live in poverty than they did 20 years ago. So there are some areas where we can say we've not done badly as a society. With that, in fact, now more women are in the paid labor force, or just the level of economic, how we economically provide for people in later life in terms of some of the basic levels of guaranteed income supplement and gains in some provinces, that we have made some strides. But there is no doubt that when you're looking at some of the issues in terms of later life, there are real challenges for people who lack the wherewithal, and some of that gets picked up in the literature on gender, and some of the issues around housing and inadequate housing, and then around ethnicity. All of those things are intersecting in terms of that question of social class by and large.
Assuming it's part of longitudinal study, I mean, that variable is...
That the idea, oh yes, certainly, because the 20,000 people who are deemed to be representative of the population at the point in time, at least, that they were recruited into the study, are representative of the population as a whole. So yeah, they are recruited from all socioeconomic groups. Chris.
Great, that's fantastic. There's so much here, but one of the things that resonated with me is you mentioned in passing about this potential for health inequalities and health disparities to increase as different populations age differently over time. I was wondering if you might want to say a few more words about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've alluded to that somewhat in the answer to Dawn about even the way we're now structuring many of the choices around housing and the cost implications. I mean, many of the kinds of facilities that are being developed have price tags of $2,000 and $3,000 and $4,000, even more per month. So they're predicated on a notion that you've got a primary residence of which you are the owner, you know, without any encumbrance. You have that to sell, and you've got, you know, what's the average house price in Canada? $127,000. You've got that to live on, and that will take you through X number of years and months. It's although at anywhere from $16,000 to $24,000 a year, you really shouldn't live too long at that rate. And so that's part of that dilemma. So I think in the housing area is going to be an area that's very interesting, and it's if you start to think about the things that are outside a federal system in Canada, where you've got variability from one province to another, that's actually one of the main factors that is a real challenge when you're looking at aging from coast to coast, for example. You know, beyond some of the diversity issues around gender or some of the access to resources implied by income. But for example, if you take something like home care, which is an area I do research in. We know that most people want to spend their later years and really to the end of their lives as much as possible residing in the home where they've lived for a long period of time. So home care and the delivery of the services in a domiciliary context becomes really important. Well, we know in Canada that where you live, not what you need, but where you live determines what you get in this country. So if I have a parent in Nova Scotia, and an in-law in Manitoba, and I'm living in British Columbia, we will get very different things. So just our structure, our provincial structure at one level is a real factor, and that's another thing that the Canadian Longitudinal Study will hopefully be able to show is what are the accumulated implications of that over time when you're living in one part of a country versus another. So that's one thing that I have glossed over completely, but provincial or regional analysis is actually fascinating to look at. Rates of institutionalization, average income, even the type of people that we recruit in to provide home care services. I found when I did research in Nova Scotia, for example, in many cases, because it's an area of high unemployment in Atlantic Canada, very frequently you recruit to provide home support services. And I'm talking here about the non-professional end of home care, the bathing, feeding, toileting, dressing that are absolutely vital to maintaining independence. The people who provide those services are very likely to be women in their mid-40s into their 50s who are endeavoring to re-enter the labor force after a period of childcare, primary responsibility for childcare, in an area with very high rates of unemployment. This is almost like a scheme to a job creation program in the province, and it works well because it also provides services in a province with a high proportion of people over the age of 65. In British Columbia, this is not the issue. What we do in British Columbia is we bring in immigrant labor. So in my studies in Vancouver, for example, 67% of the people who are providing service, in many cases, they're better trained, actually. They may be nurses in the Philippines. It may be because of the general de-skilling that we're not recognizing the skills of immigrants, so they get used that way, which is actually to the benefit of the people receiving home care. Then you get into whole other kinds of issues around challenges because they may not speak the same language as the client, or they may have very different belief systems and practices. So the workers' compensation requirement that thou must wear footwear of a certain type in the household for health and safety reasons becomes a real challenge to an older person from a certain socio-religious context where this is blasphemy to wear footwear of that sort in the home. How do you reconcile those? So there are so many different ways you could actually, from the micro to the macro level, where you could actually look at all of the different ways in which aging is experienced differently. Don't know if that's just a couple of little examples that come to mind. Okay. Mark.
And you mentioned that this longitudinal study starts at 45. I'm just curious to get your reaction. You may have said something about the same. This is the first few minutes of your talk. There was some research reported, I forget where it was done, but there was a bit of a news stir a few days ago about the discovery that apparently cognitive function, based on their results, begins to decline at 45. And there was a kind of affectation of surprise at this in the media, as though this was a terrible shock. I confess, and maybe extrapolating from my own experience, it seems perfectly obvious that my own cognitive function at 45 is not what it had been at 25, any more than my mobility at 45 is what it was when I was 25. I simply can't run as fast anymore. This doesn't actually scare me much yet, but I was surprised at the degree of maybe manufactured alarm at this, people at 45 don't do crosswords as quickly as people at 35. Sure, we age. It's a continuous process. Aging doesn't begin at 65. I'm just wondering to what extent the continuing panic reflex over there being relatively more old people around than there were in the past has to do with a continuing general immaturity in our culture. culture with respect to sort of basic realities. We know that we don't deal well with death anymore now that we don't see so much of it. It also, in certain circumstances, becomes extravagantly expensive because of the precautions that we take not to let people die, including ourselves. And it seems to me that there's a similar reflex about aging, which is one of the reasons why we actually can't, in a straightforward fashion, be glad about the fact that our prospects are much better than the prospects of people generations before. Because we don't really want to face the basic realities that there is a continuous process of human organic change. The part that could be construed as decline actually kicks in pretty early. I mean, weren't we all told in school that males reach their sexual peak at 18?
Yes.
So they should enjoy it.
Yeah.
Because it was all downhill from there on. But now apparently if you get the right prescriptions, your male sexual peak continues for a very long time.
Yeah.
There's all this stuff going around that seems to make it difficult for people ever to get to grips with their own mortality. There's a kind of morbidity around human life expectancy that probably needs to be addressed by a whole bunch of disciplines that aren't currently harnessed to any CIHR initiative. But I wondered if you had any reflections on that, perhaps particularly focused on this, wherever that research was done about 45-year-olds.
I didn't actually catch that in the media. I don't know, where was I last week? Is this a week or so ago? Because as I say, I'm usually pretty attuned to what's in. Yeah, okay, that's interesting. I did pick up the one that the aspirin a day may actually kill you rather than help you. I did see that one this week. What's interesting about that, because there are various studies which certainly show that there is decline in certain types of cognitive function. That's why I'd be interested to see the article, to actually see, well, what were they talking about? Because there's other research that shows that as we get older and we've learned, for example, to ignore certain kinds of input and information, and there are some ways in which we can actually be faster and more efficient in the long run. We might not have the speed of processing as someone half our age, but we've learned through acquisition of knowledge and information to ignore certain kinds of stimuli and be more effective and efficient in what we do. And at the end of the day, we may actually end up pretty much in the same place. So we shouldn't be worried so much about some of that speed. That learning and wisdom actually does contribute some in the. So it'd be interesting to see whether a study like that took any kind of account of other ways of knowing or coming to conclusions. But in fact, your point is not even so much the specifics of that, it's the way that we respond to that. And I was actually thinking, as you were giving the example, as being a death-denying society because we don't see it as much as we did. Well, one of the interesting things that will happen with the aging of the baby boomer population is it's going to be very visible. It's going to be highly visible in this society. So if people do not have an image of what it's like to age well or age poorly, when you've got a society where 22% of the people in the world are over the age of 60, or some high percentage are over the age of 65 in your country, I think that, and hopefully my hope is that in fact an aspiration, is that will actually make more evident the diversity, the range of variability that we're talking about. And I mean, to some extent, I'm probably attuned to it now because of the work I've been doing for the last 8 years. But it is quite interesting culturally. I mean, there certainly are these range of publications. Old age is not for sissies. Many of the images that, and my own mother actually said that to me recently on her 84th birthday, old age really isn't for sissies. But she's actually lived well past or into the period now, certainly for women of the period when she was born. She certainly lived past the life expectancy that you could have assumed at the point that she was born. And even now she's getting into the range of life expectancy for people in their 60s in terms of thinking toward the future. So she has a right to say that at a certain point, I think, is the point that I'm making. But I think a lot of it does, that issue of the narratives, the rhetoric. I actually find in a lot of the teaching that I do that some of the best images of aging and old age, and I often, when I teach, I'll start a class either with a maximum 4-minute film clip, or something from literature, which often I think gets, in research we tend to have these more negative imageries that come through, and particularly in a world where so much of the research and the funding is focused around disease-based approaches. And when you talk about that notion of bringing the whole person back together, which I said was part of the mandate of the Institute of Aging, you often get that in film or in literature in some way that I have found is often a very nice segue into what we're talking about. And it does fascinate me. There was an article or a series on CBC in the last couple of weeks, some of you may have seen it, about how far have we actually gotten in our success in treating cancer and in various kinds of diseases. And I can recall distinctly Bill Clinton saying when the Human Genome Project was unveiled, that a time will come when for children of the generation born today, cancer, the word cancer, will be a constellation. I remember thinking, I don't think so. I mean, this is pretty ambitious to think that. But we do frame so much of what is disease and curing disease. So we've got this equating of old age and disease and decrement so much in our minds, where I think that there are now many more examples. That's where that competing narrative, 70 the new 50, is inconsistent with that, and yet it is real in the lived experience of many people. We've also got some anachronisms in the society. The fact that we angst so much over the abolition of mandatory retirement always amazes me. This was brought in 1863. 65 was selected then because nobody lived to it. And Bismarck would only then have to give a pension to the few stragglers of people in the army in Germany who actually lived to 65. That over 120, 40 years later, we are still clinging to this notion, the arbitrariness of a particular number signifying your right to certain kinds of resources or not, is astonishing to me. So I think there are some very fundamental issues that absolutely reflects. And even that notion of, forget freedom 65, we'll all be working till 67. Well, we should be, actually. I mean, that actually is far more realistic, meaningful for most people, as those average age of work per person figures demonstrate, for example. So to some extent, the trends are there. People are doing these things, and it's a lot of the imagery that we have, and particularly that in the health field, a very disease-based imagery contradicts that. So I don't know if there are some other, I think there are many threads in what you're saying, Mark, that could be picked up, but that's one.
Just stop right there for time. Sure. But, thank you everyone for attending.